Speaker at prayer.
Almighty God, by whom alone kings reign and princes decree justice, and from whom alone cometh all counsel, wisdom, and understanding, we thine unworthy servants here gathered together, in thy name do most humbly beseech thee to send down thy heavenly wisdom from above, to direct and guide us in all our consultations, and grant that we, having thy fear always before our eyes, and laying aside all private interests, prejudices, and partial affections, the result of all our counsels may be to the glory of thy blessed name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the safety, honor, and happiness of the Queen, the public weal, peace, and tranquility of the island, and the uniting and knitting together of the hearts of all persons and estates within the same, in true Christian love and charity, one towards another, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Be seated, please. This Honourable House now resume its sittings. Call of the roll.
Mr. Witter, Mr. Samuda, Mr. Holness, Dr. Clarke, Mr. Shaw, Dr. Chang, Mr. Montague, Ms. Grange, Mr. Henry, Mr. Bartlett, Mr. Mackenzie, Mr. Chuck, Mr. Warmington, Mrs. Robinson, Mr. Hutchinson, Dr. Tufton, Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Malahoo Fort, Mr. Spencer, Mr. Green, Mr. Terrelong, Mr. Main, Mr. R. Scott, Mr. Azan, Mr. Green, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brown-Burke, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Leslie Campbell, Mr. Clarke, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kellier, Dr. McNeil, Ms. Nito, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Michael Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redmond, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Dr. Wheatley, Mr. Wright. Apology, Mr. Pickersgill.
Statements by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following. Ministry Paper number 14, entitled Instrument Adopted at the Annual Labour Conference of the International Labour Organization for the year 2018. Bank of Jamaica Annual Report and Statement of Accounts for the year ended December 31, 2018.
Members, at this time, I wish to recognize the presence of the former Minister of Government, Mr. Clarke. He is with us today. A number of visitors in the gallery, official visitors, friends and family of the Minister of Finance, who I always advise that he's going to give a lecture today. Please welcome friends, family and visitors, officials and otherwise. Bills brought from the Senate. Petitions, papers, reports from committees.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to lay on the table of the House a copy of the report of the Standing Finance Committee of the whole House of Representatives, consisting of all members of the House, on 1. The estimates of expenditure 2019-20 for the financial year ending March 31st, 2020. 2. The Jamaica Public Body estimates of revenue and expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2020. 3. The Government of Jamaica Fiscal Policy Paper for the financial year 2019-20. 4. The Medium-Term Debt Management Strategy for the financial year 2019-2020 to the financial year 2022-23. The 2019-2020 Public Sector Consolidated Estimates of Expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2020. 6. The Revenue Estimates 2019-2020 for the financial year ending March 31st, 2020, and the Tax Expenditure Statement 2019. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House,
Notice of motions given orally.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Be it resolved that the report of the Standing Finance Committee of the whole House of Representatives, consisting of all members of the House, on the estimates of expenditure 2019-20 for the financial year ending March 31st, 2020, the Jamaica Public Body's estimates of revenue and expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2020, the Government of Jamaica Fiscal Policy Paper for the financial year 2019-2020, the Medium-Term Debt Management Strategy for the financial year 2019-20 to the financial year 2022-23, the 2019-2020 Public Body Consolidated or Public Sector Consolidated Estimates of Expenditure for the financial year ending March 31st, 2020, the Revenue Estimates 2019-2020 for the financial year ending March 31st, 2020, and the Tax Expenditure Statement for 2019. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take this motion. Mr. Speaker, I also beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Appropriation Act 2019. Mr. Speaker, I also beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to introduce, have read a first time, and commence debate on the bill.
Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained.
Mr. Speaker, I now move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Microcredit Act 2019.
A bill shortly entitled the Microcredit Act 2019 read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of a second reading of the bill.
Public business.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of the standing orders to enable me to take the motion regarding the report of the Standing Finance Committee and to introduce and have read a first time the bill entitled the Appropriation Act 2019 and also for me to commence debate on this bill.
Those in favour? Aye. Those against? As have it. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as you know, and members of this Honourable House know, the budget debate is on the Appropriation Bill, but first the report of the Standing Finance Committee must be approved. So I now ask that the report of the Standing Finance Committee presented to us today be approved.
Those in favour? Aye. Those against? As have it. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I now move to introduce and have read a first time a bill shortly entitled the Appropriation Act 2019.
A bill shortly entitled the Appropriation Act 2019 read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice of a second reading of the bill.
Minister, as soon as you are comfortable and ready, you may proceed. Minister Clarke, are you ready to go? You may proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I now rise to begin the budget debate. Mr. Speaker, I begin by thanking Almighty God, from whom all blessings flow. Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy mercy and thy loving kindness. It was exactly 1 year and 2 days ago that the people of St. Andrew Northwestern elected me to represent them as their Member of Parliament, and I thank them for their support, and I thank my councillors and the executive of the Northwestern St. Andrew Constituency Organization, many of whom are here today, for their steadfast support, and I thank them for their work and their energy and their effort on behalf of the constituents of St. Andrew Northwestern. Mr. Speaker, I thank my parliamentary colleagues for assisting in the transition to public life with words of advice and encouragement. I wish to recognize the staff of the Houses of Parliament who are always gracious and helpful, even today, in the performance of their duties. I thank Prime Minister, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness, for his confidence and support in appointing me to the office of Minister of Finance and Public Service. Throughout his career, Prime Minister Holness has shown sincerity of purpose, humility, leadership, and courage. Which, Mr. Speaker, have earned him the trust of the Jamaican people. And it is an honor to serve in his cabinet. Jamaica benefits from a first-class team at the Ministry of Finance, and I thank them for their dedication and commitment. I thank the Financial Secretary and her staff. I thank the administrative and ancillary staff in my office who keep things going, the security staff assigned to me who always go beyond the call of duty. I also like to thank the board and management and staff of the PIOJ and the Bank of Jamaica, institutions that play a critical role in the budgetary process. Thanks to my predecessor, Manayad, Honourable Audley Shaw, for setting a good example. Thanks to Minister Favour Williams for helping to make my transition smooth, and for her support, and I congratulate her on her historic appointment as Minister of Science, Energy and Technology. Most of all, I'd like to thank my family who now share me with St. Andrew Northwestern. To my wife and children, thank you for your love and support. You helped me maintain balance and perspective, and without you, I could not do what I do. Now, I told my young children what a wonderful bunch you all are. And I hope that you'll be on your best behavior today. I am indebted to my parents for imparting values that I cherish.
First Children's Advocate.
To my late father, Justice Neville Clarke, who would have loved to have been here today. I don't know if judges can come, but I thank you for nurturing in me a passion and a belief in the promise and the potential of Jamaica, and teaching me the value of diligence. To my mother, Mary Clarke, Jamaica's first children's advocate. Thank Thank you for your prayers and for elevating the values of compassion, faith, duty, and service in our upbringing. To my brothers and sisters, thank you. My brother Trevor is here. To my uncles and aunts, one of whom is here, I'm grateful for your support. My uncle who was welcomed earlier, Claude, served in this house and served as a member of the cabinet on the other side. Every family can have one wayward soul. But he's coming home. There's hope. On this occasion of my first budget presentation, I will provide a few paragraphs on my journey here. I attended St. Richard's Primary on Red Hills Road, and there are a few students from St. Richard's Primary here today, along with one of their teachers. Welcome them. Over the summer before high school, my parents moved to Bluefields, Westmoreland, where we live by the sea, learning from fishermen at Belmont Missionary, where a family attended church and hunted crabs during the holidays. I spent all 7 years of my high school years on the top of the Santa Cruz Mountains, in Malvern, St. Elizabeth, at a school called Monroe College. And there are a few Monroe College boys here today. Bobo Skiwatan, Tala, Ala Skiwa. Though of urban birth, I was blessed with a rural and seaside upbringing. I did my undergraduate studies at the University of the West Indies before completing graduate studies and research at Oxford University. I worked in investment banking in the US and the UK before returning to Jamaica, where I've had a career in business and finance for 20 years prior to my entry to representational politics. Over the course of that career, I've had the privilege of starting, acquiring, building and operating businesses in Jamaica and a majority of the countries in the Caribbean and Central America and further afield across a very wide range of industries. I've operated in many diverse political and economic environments that make up our region, and I have first-hand experience of some of what has worked, some of what has not worked across these countries. Mr. Speaker, it's been an honor to serve Jamaica as chairman of various public sector enterprises, including the National Housing Trust, the Port Authority of Jamaica, and the Heart Trust. It was a privilege to serve Jamaica as a senator appointed by Prime Minister Holness, then leader of the opposition, where I focused on business and economic policy legislation during the period of the 2013 engagement with the IMF until 2015. And as an ambassador, where I was a principal interlocutor with the IMF and other multilaterals out of the office of the Prime Minister. And it's also been a privilege to serve as an advisor to Prime Minister Holness on economic policy. 10 years ago, Mr. Speaker, along with other like-minded persons, I started an NGO that uses music as a tool of social empowerment in Kingston and Spanish Town, and thousands of young people over that 10 years have been exposed to reading and writing music and playing instruments through that program. Mr. Speaker, I've had a full and diverse life before representational politics. Throughout my entire life, Mr. Speaker, I've never sought the limelight. I've always been content with working behind the scenes, supporting and promoting others, many others. But then, Mr. Speaker, the call came to serve Jamaica in a different capacity, a capacity that provides the potential to maximize positive change, but that also requires certain personal sacrifices. With the tremendous support of my family friends, and colleagues have answered that call, and I stand before you today and pledge again to serve Jamaica with diligence and sincerity. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is in transition. A new Jamaica is emerging. Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, is moving in the right direction. Having found ourselves one of the most indebted countries in the world only a few years ago, Jamaica is emerging as a shining example to the world of what can be achieved when there's unity of purpose. At the end of this financial year, by March 31st, Jamaica's debt to GDP ratio will fall to 96%, which will be the lowest level of debt in nearly 2 decades and the first time below 100% over that period. This is a national achievement of which all Jamaicans can be proud. The road here, Mr. Speaker, has not been easy, and all segments of Jamaican society have contributed to this success. Mr. Speaker, may I ask my colleagues in this House to recognize the role played by the public sector unions and staff. The role played, Mr. Speaker, by the financial institutions and investing community. The role played by the broader private sector, Mr. Speaker, by the Economic Policy Oversight Committee, the Social Partnership, and civil society, Mr. Speaker, the media, the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, the Bank of Jamaica, the Planning Institute of Jamaica, and ministries and departments and agencies from across the government of Jamaica. And, Mr. Speaker, the role played by successive governments and oppositions through this transition. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is the world's only example in recent times of a small country that has reduced its public debt by the equivalent of half of its gross domestic product in a short time frame, without handouts, without bailouts, or without bilateral debt support from friends or partners. We found ourselves completely on our own and had no choice but to rescue ourselves from our own resources.
Hear, hear.
The good news, Mr. Speaker, that this demonstrates our capacity to achieve our greatest dreams and aspirations for our country if we can summon the courage, the fortitude and foresight, and the humility and wisdom to work together for the common good. Mr. Speaker, this achievement thus far ranks among the greatest bipartisan successes that we have had, along with the electoral reform that led to the emergence of the Electoral Office of Jamaica and the dramatic improvements to the integrity of the electoral system in Jamaica, and the constitutional reform that gave rise to the Charter of Rights. The people of Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, desire of their parliament and leaders many more such successes. However, Mr. Speaker, on each of these occasions, Jamaica was brought to the brink before we were driven collectively to action. I'm sure the Jamaican people would prefer that these outcomes result from their leaders working together proactively with duty, with wisdom, and foresight. And this is a call that must be answered today. Mr. Speaker, the period of fiscal prudence did not arise automatically. Jamaica was forced to confront its difficulties by turning once again to the International Monetary Fund, as we have done many times before. In fact, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica has had 16 standby and extended fund facility arrangements with the IMF since independence, which have had a cumulative length of 32 years. We cannot be proud of that. I have some of them listed, and they're in this speech when you get a copy of it. I have all of them listed. Mr. Speaker, this dependence is inconsistent with the Jamaican identity. It's inconsistent with our identity. of a proud and independent people with a message for the world. Yet, for my generation, all we have ever known is life in and out of structural adjustment programs with the international community. It falls to my generation, our generation, to change that. Mr. Speaker, our goal and aim should be to put ourselves in a position where we have the fiscal and the monetary buffers that provide insulation in lean times. We must be like Joseph, the son of Jacob, who stocked the barn in good times, so that we can retrieve from our own barn in bad times, instead of having to depend on the international community. The Joseph principle, Mr. Speaker, should be our principle. Our engagement with the IMF this time around has been different. With just under 3 years of the previous administration and just over 3.5 years of this administration by November 2019, Jamaica is set to complete our engagements with the IMF, having fully lived up to our commitment. What started as an IMF program became Jamaica's program with IMF support. The Andrew Holness government terminated the $930 million extended fund facility with the IMF 6 months into office, which was also 6 months before the maturity of the EFF. With the EFF, Jamaica borrowed from the IMF, and in its place, Jamaica entered into a larger $1.6 billion precautionary standby arrangement. We are now 2.5 years into this precautionary standby facility with 6 months to go. And Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that so far, Jamaica has had no need to draw down and borrow funds from the IMF. Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, is moving in the right direction. Our economic reform program has delivered for Jamaica, is delivering for Jamaica, and will continue to deliver for Jamaica. For these reasons, Mr. Speaker, the fundamental essence of our economic reform program will be maintained even when our agreement with the IMF ends. On my appointment as Minister of Finance, I established the economic policy direction as the pursuit of economic independence, the promotion of economic opportunity for all, and the protection of the vulnerable. This, Mr. Speaker, is the policy architecture that is required for us to achieve growth with equity. The struggle for greater levels of equity has occupied the Jamaican consciousness for hundreds of years, and rightly so. Over that time, we have made incredible progress on the march for greater levels of equity and social justice, and we continue that march even today. However, no society is disconnected from its past, and historical inequities have undoubtedly cast a long shadow. Our two major political parties at their inception and through the course of their histories have identified with the struggle of the Jamaican people. We are one of few countries in the world where the trade union movement is represented and entrenched on both sides of the political aisle, with both major parties, political parties, allied with major unions. As for the Jamaica Labour Party, it grew out of the first and oldest union movement in the Caribbean that was formed to agitate on behalf of the Jamaican working class. Today, the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union is the largest multi-industry trade union in the Caribbean. Equal rights and justice has been the rallying cry of the Jamaica Labour Party for 75 years. Repeated at every meeting of the Jamaica Labour Party, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered. Jamaica Labour Party administrations from the 1940s to the present time have advanced the cause of equity and justice in Jamaica. I am sure, Mr. Speaker, the other side would make a similar claim. As a result, Mr. Speaker, the issue of equity has always been in the political economy and springs from the unique foundation and alignments of our major political parties. This, Mr. Speaker, is a source of strength, yet it is often undermined by the political class itself. Much of our political discourse, Mr. Speaker, is about trying to deny this unique historical reality, and worse, denying our respective contributions in this struggle. This, Mr. Speaker, is nationally self-defeating. It is nationally disempowering. It is empty, and it only serves the narrow interests of some politicians on some occasions, and not the long-term interests of the people. On the other hand, Mr. Speaker, the quest for economic growth has not always been a part of the political economy, even though the expansion of the economy is a necessary condition for us to achieve the aspiration and dreams of all Jamaicans. Growth and equity are not mutually exclusive. Rather, they go hand in hand, and they're mutually reinforcing. Higher levels of growth can provide the means through which greater levels of equity can be achieved. And greater societal equity increases the productive potential of our people and fosters greater social harmony, both of which are conducive to higher economic output. Equity, Mr. Speaker, is multifaceted too. We need equity for all members of our society, for basic school children and tertiary students, for civil servants, and even for politicians, for inner-city youth and for small business, for men and women, for children and pensioners, for the 92% of Jamaicans employed Jamaicans who are employed in the private sector, and for the 8% of employed Jamaicans who are employed in the public sector, for rural and urban, for able and disabled, and even for Jamaicans, I dare say, who find themselves behind bars. We need equity for all Jamaicans. However, Mr. Speaker, we often speak about equity from our own perspective without recognizing the legitimate equity aspirations of the broader public good. One of the lessons of our history is that some policies that seek to address issues of equity in a current time frame have had devastating impact on future generations through the accumulation of an unsustainable debt or through high inflation, both of which create severe intergenerational inequity. The debt incurred by prior generations has been a chain that has limited the prospects of successive generations. In order to guarantee equity across generations, Mr. Speaker, we can only sustainably finance the march for greater equity from the dividends of economic expansion. Mr. Speaker, over our 40-year period of low growth, successive administrations have refrained from implementing bold, pro-growth fiscal policy that serves the public good and that ultimately advances the cause of equity. Mr. Speaker, that is about to change. What I will lay out today is a budget crafted to maintain a path of economic independence that provides economic opportunity for all, that protects the vulnerable, and by so doing will deliver growth with equity. Mr. Speaker, our ability to achieve our aspiration of growth with equity is enhanced by economic independence. It is the goal of the Andrew Holness government, the goal of this generation, that Jamaica be an economically independent country. If you use the historical fact of our seeking support from the international community, Jamaica, though politically dependent, became serially dependent on the international community for economic support and assistance beginning in the 1970s for a variety of reasons, some of which were outside of the control of the government, some of which were due to economic policy at the time. That dependence, Mr. Speaker, has continued for a majority of the nearly 50 years since then, and the chart I showed earlier makes that case. Economic independence means that we as a country are empowered to chart our economic destiny, to set out well thought out economic priorities, and to provide the framework, rules, and environment that will allow citizens to pursue economic activities in a way that promotes growth and well-being for all. Economic independence does not mean a withdrawal from the global economic and financial system. It does not mean that we cannot benefit from financial flows and technological know-how, but it does mean that we responsibly take our destiny into our own hands. This is important, Mr. Speaker, as otherwise we fit into the vision of others for ourselves, and we'll not have the chance to pursue our own dreams. While we may be at a certain stage of development right now, our vision is not to be hewers of wood nor drawers of stone. Rather, Mr. Speaker, we are a people of destiny. We are a nation of purpose with a unique role to play in this world. With policies that achieve and maintain economic independence, that provide economic opportunity for all, that protect the vulnerable, sustained over time, Mr. Speaker, we will eventually produce aircraft components and medical devices right here in Jamaica. We will lead in artificial intelligence and internet security. People will come here for jobs rather than us migrating there. That is the vision, Mr. Speaker. It transcends our circumstances, and we must be united in that vision for Jamaica and the people of Jamaica. A necessary and fundamental principle to abide by if we are to achieve this vision is to manage our financial affairs in such a way to maintain a stable and sustainable economic path that guarantees stability for future generations. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is now in the best shape as compared to any other period over the last 50 years. To achieve economic independence. Mr. Speaker, our economic independence is best assured by having strong domestic institutions. As Minister of Finance, that is what I've set out to do, catalyze the emergence of strong institutions. In October last year, I tabled the Bank of Jamaica Amendment Act aimed at modernizing, strengthening, and resourcing the Bank of Jamaica. This act is currently before a Joint Select Committee of Parliament. Nothing, Mr. Speaker, destroys economic independence like high runaway inflation. High pervasive inflation of the past has ruined tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives. We all know people who have had that experience on both sides of the aisle. The primary and secondary effects of inflation, high inflation, have devastated thousands of businesses. We have lived it. We know it. High inflation is synonymous with instability. It works against investment. It is not conducive to long-term thinking. It retards or reverses development. It leads to dysfunctional behavior. It impoverishes people. High inflation, Mr. Speaker, is the enemy of the poor and those on fixed incomes. Anyone who cares about economic opportunity for all or about social equity must be concerned with the pursuit of low, stable, and predictable inflation. The amendments proposed in the BOJ Amendment Act, Mr. Speaker, make price stability the primary goal of monetary policy. It increases transparency and monetary policy decisions, provides greater accountability to the people through the Parliament, and improves governance. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is now at a halfway mark in our debt reduction trajectory. As good as 96% of GDP sounds, our own experience shows that even this reduced level of debt leaves us vulnerable to external shocks. This is why this government will seek, in consultation and discussion, to further institutionalize economic independence by strengthening our fiscal responsibility framework with the establishment of a fiscal council. Our fiscal rules became law in 2010 and were strengthened in 2014, where a fiscal balance is prescribed with a view of achieving a 60% debt to GDP target by 2026. The Fiscal Council will be the guardian and interpreter of those fiscal rules, which already exist, and will help us maintain a path of fiscal credibility long into the future. Mr. Speaker, even with a stronger central bank and a credible fiscal council, Mother Nature could intervene to undermine our efforts. Like much of our region, Jamaica is vulnerable to natural disasters. While events on the scale of Hurricane Gilbert only occur every few decades, the data shows and our experience tells us that higher frequency events cost Jamaica and cost Jamaicans, and it's the vulnerable who end up paying. Natural disasters result in unplanned public expenditure or the reallocation of already committed financial resources for reconstruction, rehabilitation, and repair. Budgetary revenues fall in natural disasters. Central bank reserves come under pressure, and the need to borrow increases. Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, has done too much work and made too many sacrifices to leave ourselves completely open and exposed in a post-IMF program environment to the potential fiscal impact of natural disaster. The pursuit of economic independence requires an institutional response to the fiscal risk of natural disaster. And for this reason, the Ministry of Finance is commencing the policy process for a public financial management policy for natural disaster risk, which we intend to submit to the Cabinet and, if approved, lay in Parliament. Mr. Speaker, we'll be pursuing a strategy that provides layers of protection that include accumulating fiscal savings in the contingency fund, which our forefathers established in our Constitution, with a great degree of foresight. We've never used it to any significant degree. So accumulated fiscal savings in a contingency fund only to be used in the event of natural disasters on one layer. Another layer, contingent credit available in the event of natural disasters. And we have one now with IDB. Another layer, the Caribbean Catastrophe Insurance Facility, which we have a contract. And at the top layer, Mr. Speaker, for the most severe events, catastrophe bonds or catastrophe-linked insurance. It is the ambition and vision of the government of Andrew Holness that Jamaica remain decidedly on a course towards full economic independence. And Mr. Speaker, we are well on our way in that regard. We are in a period of unprecedented economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, now I just turn to overviewing achievements in the 18-19 financial year. Mr. Speaker, macroeconomic stability, which has long eluded us, is now entrenched. We have had low, stable inflation for 4 years. Domestic interest rates are at levels never before seen in Jamaica. The central bank has lowered the policy rate 4 times in this financial year alone. And the policy rate now stands at 1.5. You like that one? 1.5%. Which is the lowest in Jamaica's entire history. market interest rates for individuals and businesses have never been lower. Many individuals and businesses can access loans at single-digit rates, something that would have been deemed unattainable, unthinkable a few years ago. These record low interest rates are allowing individuals and businesses to borrow to accomplish their goals and dreams. According to Bank of Jamaica data, loan growth is accelerating and stood at 24% for the 12-month period ending September 2018, the highest in more than 6 years, while mortgage growth hit a high of 19% over the 12-month period ending in June 2018. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica has enjoyed 15 consecutive quarters of economic growth. Started, and based on the PIOJ forecast, have a graph on it soon. Based on the PIOJ forecast, that record is set to stretch to 16 consecutive quarters for the period ending December 2018. Mr. Speaker, since we started measuring economic growth quarterly, listen to this. Since we started measuring economic growth quarterly in 1997, this period here is the longest unbroken stretch of quarterly economic growth that Jamaica has ever experienced. While the growth rate for the first half of the fiscal year of 2%, and the growth rate forecasted for 2018-19 by the PIOJ of 1.9% still leaves room for improvement, let me remind this House that this growth rate, Mr. Speaker, represents the highest growth rate that we have had in 12 years. And as I said a while ago, it represents the longest period of growth in 21 years. Mr. Speaker, GDP, measured in constant dollars, is at its highest level in Jamaica's history. The growth rate, though it has room for improvements, for the first half of 2018-19, Mr. Speaker, is double the average growth rate in the last 40 years. It is 4 times the average growth rate of the last 20 years. And it is 10 times the average growth rate of the last 10 years. Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, is moving in the right direction. Mr. Speaker, there's somebody I know, a particularly compassionate individual who, on his way to work, he would pass through a particular 4-way crossing, and there'd be youth who come to clean his windscreen. And as a compassionate individual, he would often find ways of helping in a productive way and a sustainable way, particularly around Christmas time. And this last Christmas, one of these persons who he'd help, he didn't see at the 4-way crossing. Didn't see him once, didn't see him twice, didn't see him 3 times. And he began to get concerned as to what could have happened. He inquired about him and inquired of some elders in his community. And one of the old ladies in the community looked at him and said, "Who, Johnny? Is Johnny you looking for? Johnny gone work! Johnny have work!" Johnny have work! Mr. Because that story has been, and that's a true story. That story has been repeated across the length and breadth of Jamaica. Yes. Mr. Speaker, there are more persons employed in Jamaica today than ever before in the history of Jamaica. This, Mr. Speaker, is growth with equity. Our contract with you, our contract with you, our contract with you is that we will manage, we will manage the economy in a way that encourages investment and expansion, and that delivers jobs for you, the public. Mr. Speaker, female unemployment is at the lowest level ever. Mr. Speaker, this is growth with equity. Growth with equity, and Jamaica is moving in the right direction. Jamaica's credit rating, Mr. Speaker, has been upgraded by the international rating agency Fitch to the highest rating in 10 years. Mr. Speaker, another international credit rating agency, Standard & Poor's, has revised outlook to positive from stable. Our pipeline of foreign direct investments is long and robust across a range of industries: mining, tourism, infrastructure, BPO, construction, among others. Mr. Speaker, the Port of Kingston experienced a 7% growth in containers moved in the calendar year 2018 over 2017. Housing starts are at the highest levels they have in over 20 years, and tourism arrivals, as Mas Ed will tell you, is at record levels. Mr. Speaker, the Jamaica Manufacturers and Exporters Association tells me that their members cannot find enough factory space. Manufacturers are popping up all over the place, operating out of their homes and their garages. The demand for manufacturing space is high, Prime Minister, and it is outstripping supply. Factories, corporation. I know you have something to say about that. Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, is moving in the right direction. Central government capital expenditure, including infrastructure that we rely on for development, was at the highest level it's been for 12 years. CapEx for 2018-19, just by comparison to see the progress, is 3 times what it was 4 years ago in 2014-15, 3 times. CapEx today is twice as much as it was 3 years ago in 2015-16. Jamaica, Mr. Speaker, is moving in the right direction. Our foreign exchange reserves in the central bank are at the highest levels ever, and our reserve adequacy stands at 112%, which strengthens our ability to continue to trade globally. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is moving in the right direction. We're experiencing a time of great economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to some policy priorities for the upcoming financial year.
Minister, before you proceed any further, I ask you to take a rest and allow the Leader of Government Business to extend your time by a motion. The Minister's time for speaking has expired. Minister, you may now.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the member be allowed to speak for enough time to enable him to complete his presentation.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, public procurement reform, which has been pursued over the last 5 years, will come into force in the next financial year. I remind this House that the Public Procurement Amendment Act was passed in August 2018, and 2 sets of regulations were passed in June and July of 2018. I have requested of His Excellency the Governor General that the Public Procurement Commission and the Procurement Review Board be issued their instruments of appointment effective April 1st, 2019. Since the launch of the electronic procurement system, almost all Government of Jamaica procuring entities are using the system. The training and onboarding of suppliers is an ongoing activity, and many private sector industries have already been trained and are using the system. The new public procurement manual will be available by April. All 43 standard bidding documents have been completed, and the draft consultant and technical working group will be finalizing the revision exercise by April 1st. The final set of regulation, which addresses the registration and classification of suppliers, and which can only come into effect after the establishment of the Public Procurement Commission, will be tabled in the first quarter of the new financial year. May I remind you, Mr. Speaker, remind this House and by extension the public, that the new procurement regime will allow for set-asides which reserve a portion of the annual procurement budget for Jamaican micro, small and medium-sized enterprises. It will have domestic margins of preference which allow for preferential treatment of Jamaican suppliers in accessing GOJ procurement contracts in specific circumstances. I intend, Mr. Speaker, to table the set-aside and domestic margins of preference in this Honourable House in the first quarter of financial year 1920. The new procurement regime will enhance the potential for Jamaican MSMEs to compete for larger shares of Government of Jamaica procurement contracts. This, Mr. Speaker, represents economic opportunity for all. Pension reform, Mr. Speaker. Pension funds have over $500 billion of assets and play a critical role in securing a stable future for retirees and providing a pool of domestic assets that can be productively invested. Regulations to broaden the pool of assets that pension funds can invest in were tabled in the House in February. Comments from the opposition are being incorporated, and the regulations will be retabled after the budget. Private pension reform will address vesting and portability, membership in more than one pension arrangement depending on circumstances, dependent disability pensions and indexation, as well as more effective regulation by the Financial Services Commission, and will incentivize increased participation in pension plans. We will table the pension reform bill in Parliament before the end of the 2019-20 financial year. This government intends to broaden social protection by increasing the percentage of the workforce that have access to pensions. This, Mr. Speaker, is economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, the government passed groundbreaking public pension reform last year, the culmination of a decade of work. We now intend to implement technology to ensure that public sector officers benefit from efficient and timely processing and payments of their pensions. Today, the public pension system is paper-based and it's manual. It suffers from incomplete records and that are dispersed. Service records have to be compiled at the time of retirement, and that's manual, and it results in extensive delays. As a result, Mr. Speaker, the government is implementing the Public Employees Pensions Administration System, which is an online application which will be accessible to stakeholders via secured internet. And eligible public sector employees will be able to view their pension-related services, their pension entitlements, and their options. The application will automatically compute pensions, Mr. Speaker, and we are now engaged in training and data input, and our aim eventually is that for every public officer, your first pension check is received 1 month after your last paycheck. This, Mr. Speaker, is economic opportunity for all. The government, Mr. Speaker, is pleased on public sector reform and is pleased that unions representing over 95 or 96% of public sector employees have signed a 4-year wage deal for the period 2017-2021. I thank the various unions and their members for their professionalism in the negotiation process. Mr. Speaker, the public sector wage bill represents the single largest allocation in the budget outside of debt service. And so the management of the growth of the total size of the wage bill is of strategic importance and has an impact on every single Jamaican. Public sector transformation, for that reason, among others, like efficiency and service delivery, remains an ongoing reform. For the first time, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is projected to meet the wage to GDP target of 9% for the financial year 2018-2019 and for the upcoming financial year under our fiscal responsibility law. And again, we thank the public sector unions and the workers for their leadership and cooperation in this result. However, Mr. Speaker, the structure of public sector compensation is overly complicated with over 325 separate grades, and it is non-transparent with over 175 allowance types that breeds inequities in ministries, departments, and agencies and across the public sector. This, Mr. Speaker, represents a fiscal risk as attempts to address genuine imbalances in public sector compensation can have unintended and unforeseen consequences because of the unwieldy nature of the entire system. The government is therefore and will be conducting a review of public sector compensation with the aim of simplifying and streamlining public sector compensation, making it more transparent and equitable while addressing imbalances and inequities over time. The government intends to work closely with our partners in the union to this end and to complete this exercise prior to the start of the negotiations for the next bargaining period. Mr. Speaker, we have accelerated the rationalization of public bodies, and a number of mergers, privatizations, and reintegrations and related actions have been announced and are being carried out. We intend to implement shared services in human resource management this year and begin shared corporate services with respect to audit and public relations in the upcoming financial year. We'll make greater use of technology to bring greater efficiency in public service delivery and to control costs. Mr. Speaker, there are many efforts to improve service delivery in the public sector, and I want to briefly describe one such effort in the Ministry of Finance. Tax Administration Jamaica intends to improve its physical infrastructure, increase the cadre of cashiers, expand its queue management system, and implement additional e-service solutions to improve customer service delivery and the customer experience. For example, in the upcoming financial year, Tax Administration Jamaica will develop a mobile app to accommodate payment of certain tax types, including property tax and traffic ticket fines. In the upcoming financial year, we will begin designing and the planning process for new tax offices to replace those in Portmore, in Crossroads, in Christiana, Santa Cruz, St. Anne's Bay, Brownstown, Buff Bay, as well as retrofitting and reorganization of the tax offices in Mandeville and Montego Bay. Mr. Speaker, let me turn my attention to the issue of increasing the provision of financial services to all Jamaicans. Technocrats and economists refer to this as financial deepening, but in essence, it is simply a focus on creating an environment where every Jamaican can have improved access to financing and to realize their dreams and aspirations. We often speak about the opportunity that arises from the reduced need of the government to borrow, and very often we focus on it from the point of view of good fiscal management. However, Mr. Speaker, the more important focus, in my view, is that this reduced borrowing means that the same resources that were previously lent to the government are now available to facilitate private economic activity, to facilitate you, the people of Jamaica. The focus of the government is to accelerate this process and to build out some of the mechanisms through which this additional liquidity can become available. In November 2018, I established an interagency financial deepening implementation group chaired by Jamaican international economist David Marston and comprised of representatives from the BOJ, the DBJ, the FSC, and the Stock Exchange to accelerate this work. I'll first speak about the progress made in the factoring of receivables. Receivables represent one of the largest assets of small business. In the coming months, the DBJ will be working in partnership with the private sector to launch a program where a supplier with a legitimate invoice evidencing that it has supplied goods or services to a buyer can present this to a financial institution. And so rather than waiting 1, 3, or 6 months to get paid, the holder of the invoice can be paid immediately, less a market-related discount. The invoice or receivable becomes a new way of financing and reduces the need for the supplier to try to get a loan while waiting to be paid. The work to bring this on stream is advanced. The necessary regulatory changes are in place. There are certain tax changes that have to happen. The product design is being finalized. Consultation with stakeholders will begin shortly after procuring the right technology, and a pilot will be launched later in 2019. This, Mr. Speaker, will bring financing options to small business that they don't have today and represents economic opportunity for all in action. Mr. Speaker, we intend to improve access to capital markets through ensuring that private issues can be traded on the Jamaica of debt securities can be traded on the stock exchange, and for companies listed on the stock exchange to have an easier time to engage in exempt distributions. The FSC will shortly clarify its guidance to ensure that companies that already have met disclosure and due diligence requirements for a listing on the stock exchange and want to issue debt are able to do so without delays. This will lead to greater transparency in the pricing of debt instruments. It will create further competition in the financing space and create greater economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, the third near-term deliverable is the launch of a program for the independent rating of issuers of fixed income securities. We want our pension and insurance funds to be invested prudently, and assets that they invest in should be of good quality. For borrowers with ratings comes the benefit of better pricing of their placements. For financial institutions, ratings will allow for a diversification of assets that qualify as liquid. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica is in transition. A new Jamaica is emerging. The central bank, Mr. Speaker, is in transition. The central bank has been pursuing inflation targeting even in advance of modernization. Inflation outcomes have been lower than target, which has provided room for the central bank to lower interest rates, providing further support for economic expansion. The central bank has lowered the cash reserve ratio, thereby releasing $16 billion of liquid resources to banks for them to further support increases in loans on better terms. The foreign exchange market, Mr. Speaker, is also in transition. We're moving away from a one-way foreign exchange market characterized by zero fluctuations and frequent interventions to one characterized by two-way movements, market-determined prices, non-zero volatility, and less frequent interventions. If you add interventions over the successive 12-month period, they're markedly less now than they were 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. This transition, Mr. Speaker, is not without teething pains. The central bank will therefore be investing in foreign exchange trading infrastructure that will allow for greater transparency in pricing, that will catalyze less uncertainty, which is often caused by an absence of information. Mr. Speaker, we will table regulations this coming financial year to improve governance of public bodies. These regulations, of which a first draft has already been produced, will prescribe the process for the nomination, selection, and appointment of persons to the Board of Public Bodies. The regulations will improve the transparency of the process and provide an opportunity for a wider pool of Jamaicans to serve on the Board of Public Bodies. These new regulations will therefore deepen participation in our democracy. The new regulations will provide greater assurance that the appropriate skills and the relevant expertise and experience are available to the boards of public bodies. Mr. Speaker, just briefly on other legislative priorities, the Microcredit Act was recently tabled, and that's designed to ensure that microcredit services can operate in an environment of transparency and accountability, and those who use microcredit services, whether they be individuals or informally operated MSMEs, are protected from predatory lending practices, and that microcredit organizations are not used for money laundering. The process, Mr. Speaker, with respect to oversight of the credit unions by the Bank of Jamaica is ongoing and will involve the tabling and eventual passage of two companion pieces of legislation, namely the Credit Unions Act and amendments to the Cooperative Societies Act. These bills, and we're working together on that, these bills have been drafted and are now going through the review process. Mr. Speaker, we intend to repeal and replace the Customs Act to modernize custom procedures with the advance of the tabling of this new Customs Act that will improve Jamaica's competitiveness, expand opportunity for MSMEs, and accommodate logistics activities that are difficult to undertake under the current Act. Mr. Speaker, now I turn to an overview of the 2019-20 Central Government Expenditure Budget. For the first time, Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Finance and Planning, of its own accord, has made a citizen's guide to this budget, which represents in plain English for every Jamaican the information that I'm about to share today. It was available in the two national newspapers, and it is available on the Ministry's website. For the financial year, Mr. Speaker, 2019-20, the central government is programmed to spend a total of $835.9 billion, of which $803 billion will be funded from the Consolidated Fund and $32.7 billion from appropriations in aid. The $803 billion to be funded from the Consolidated Fund comprises non-debt expenditure of $528.8 billion, public debt service of $274.4 billion. Of the non-debt expenditure, Mr. Speaker, the $528.8 billion, it is comprised of $421.2 billion of recurrent expenditure, $72.1 billion of capital expenditure, and below-the-line expenditures of $35.5 billion, which includes towards a number of activities, including capitalization of the BOJ. Approximately $210.4 billion of recurrent expenditures will go towards the compensation of central government employees. The amount allocated for compensation includes the increases agreed with public sector unions. The remaining $210.7 billion of the recurrent expenditures proposed for financial year 2019-2020 will go towards funding recurrent programs. Nominally, the 2019-20 allocation for recurrent programs is flat relative to the 2018-19 revised recurrent estimates. But this, Mr. Speaker, comparison between both financial years, for it to be informative, must take account of the fact of the significant increases in the first and second supplementary estimates over the approved 2018-19 budget, and the approximately $8.3 billion of the amounts provided in financial year 2018-19 first and second supplementary estimates, which were for meeting one-off expenditures, which will not be repeated in the upcoming financial year. Recurrent expenditures, Mr. Speaker, includes $2.7 billion to the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation to meet expenses associated with island-wide disaster mitigation and various road improvement programs, and $339.9 million to support planning and other pre-investment activities associated with 3 major investment projects being coordinated by the Urban Development Corporation, which are the construction of a new Parliament building, the establishment of Government Oval at National Heroes Park, and the development of Port Royal. The 2019-20 capital budget of the central government, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, is $72.1 billion and reflects a 5% increase over the 2018-19 revised estimates, and which more than doubles the capital expenditure levels inherited by this administration. I will now provide some details, Mr. Speaker, on how the capital expenditure budget has been allocated. National security, with an allocation of $20.2 billion, or 28% of the total capital expenditure, has received the largest share of the capital budget, representing an increase of $7.5 billion, or 61%, over the 2018-19 revised estimates. This is reflective of the priority that the government places on improving security for the citizens of Jamaica. This allocation, which will facilitate implementation of new and ongoing projects under Plan Secure Jamaica, Plan Secure Jamaica includes $2.9 billion to complete the final phase of Lathbury Barracks and the first phase of Burt Barracks in Montego Bay, and the upgrading of the Moneague training camp. This, Mr. Speaker, is a deliberate strategy of regionalization. Prior to this, military personnel were not ideally distributed across Jamaica. Improving barracks in central Jamaica and establishing new barracks in western Jamaica allows the troops of the JDF to be available in all counties at all times, allowing for more efficient response as required. Mr. Speaker, there's $11.8 billion to continue the acquisition of general and specialized equipment, including coastal surveillance equipment, telecommunications equipment, cybersecurity equipment, and aircraft and ship for the security forces. This, Mr. Speaker, will allow Jamaica to improve its border security and stem the flow of illegal weapons and contraband, which fuels organized crime. Mr. Speaker, the capital expenditure for national security includes $1.8 billion for the acquisition of patrol and other security vehicles, including approximately 1,000 motor vehicles for the police to improve their mobility. Brand new car. Brand new car. Mr. Speaker, there will be $1 billion allocated to facilitate the renovation of 60 police stations island-wide. Including new police stations in Savannah Lamar and Spanish Town, and to commence, and many other places, and to commence construction of the autopsy suite in Kingston. Mr. Speaker, there's $393 million for the construction and improvement of correctional facilities, the Diamond Crest Correctional Center, the St. Catherine Adult Correctional Center, the St. Catherine Adult Correctional Center, the Horizon Correctional Center, and preliminary activities for the Long Pond Detention Center. Equity, Mr. Speaker. Equity, Mr. Speaker, belongs to inmates too, and importantly, belongs to those who work in those environments, our correctional service officers. Mr. Speaker, the dedication of significant resources to national security arises out of the government's conviction that the high incidence of violent crime is a significant source of inequity in Jamaica. Jamaicans who live in areas that are subject to consistent violence or under the control of organized crime are denied an equal chance in life. Due to the restricting nature of pervasive violent crime, they are victims of unequal access to services and unequal opportunities in the workplace. If we care about equity and justice, Mr. Speaker, we must care about national security, not for some, but for all. The second largest allocation of $18.4 billion in the 2019-20 capital budget will facilitate major infrastructure works being implemented by the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. And it includes $4.8 billion to complete works along Mandela Highway, Constant Spring Road, Hagley Park Road, and the Ferris to Macfield Road under the Mid-P program. $586 million to continue civil works on the Junction Road and achieve 100% completion. And $586 million and to achieve 100% completion in financial year 1920. Yes. And Mr. Speaker, $8.4 billion to facilitate land acquisition, design, supervision, and commencement of civil works along the southeastern corridors and the Maypen to Williams Street leg of the East-West Highway under the South Coast Highway Improvement Project. Mr. Speaker, $950 million will be allocated to commence major development works in Montego Bay, with $400 million going towards the rehabilitation of the groins in order to protect the shoreline and marine ecosystems along the Montego Bay waterfront, and $550 million towards the development of a 6.5 hectares active public park with recreational amenities for the people of Montego Bay. For the people of St. James. Yes. $3.7 billion, Mr. Speaker, to the Ministry of Health, with added support of $2 billion from the National Health Fund. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to declare that $1 billion of the $3.7 billion is earmarked to carry out rehabilitation work on the Cornwall Regional Hospital. Mr. Speaker, the government is using the capital budget to expand economic opportunity for all. And ensuring rural development, Mr. Speaker, is a key component of expanding economic opportunity. Where the rural go, the government is therefore allocating $795 million to facilitate the implementation of projects by the Rural Water Supply Company Limited to upgrade rural water supplies in several parishes, which will involve the rehabilitation of catchment tanks, the installation of guttering and storage and solar pumps in schools and public institutions. Mr. Speaker, this allocation represents an approximate eightfold increase from the $100 million allocated in 2018-19, reflecting the priority that this government places on rural water. Mr. Speaker, The continued performance of the agricultural sector is key to improve growth outcomes and to expanding economic opportunity in rural Jamaica. The following allocations have therefore been made. 752 million to continue the rehabilitation and development of rural farm roads. $1.1 billion, Mr. Speaker, to continue the expansion and rehabilitation of irrigation infrastructure in order to make lands more productive and available for agricultural purposes and to reduce the recurrent and rainfall. This, Mr. Speaker, will positively impact the Essex Valley and Pedro Plains. 326 million has been allocated to continue the development of the Spring Gardens Agri Park through the improvement of on-farm roads, rehabilitation of the packing house, installing pumping equipment, and installing river training structures on a nearby river to reduce soil erosion. This, Mr. Speaker, is a government that's concerned with economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, finance is the oxygen of business. We want to move to a Jamaica where private financial institutions provide competitive credit to all businesses. However, Mr. Speaker, there are structural bottlenecks in the system that prevent hurdles. And given the government's commitment to expanding economic opportunity for all, we will be taking steps to improve the access for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises by significantly increasing allocations for MSME financing to the Development Bank of Jamaica and other intermediaries. In financial year 2019-20, a total of $1.8 billion will be made available for loans to the sector. There will be $1 billion through the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, of which $600 million is to provide loan guarantees through a credit enhancement and loan guarantee fund to MSMEs who have limited or no collateral required to access loans. This, Mr. Speaker, is an increase of $350 million or 140% from the $250 million in 2018-19. Mr. Speaker, there's $400 million to finance risk capital financing for MSMEs, which is a four-fold increase from the $100 million in 2018-19. Mr. Speaker, there will be $763 million through the Ministry of Finance and Public Service. So $1 billion through Ministry of Economic Growth, $763 million directly from the Ministry of Finance, of which $500 million, Mr. Speaker, will be specifically reserved for micro businesses, those businesses with sales less than $10 million, who are often left out when you set aside funds for MSMEs. And there'll be $263 million line of credit between the Ministry of Finance and the DBJ under the Foundation for Competitiveness and Growth project. This, Mr. Speaker, literally represents economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, with the technical and financial support of the Inter-American Development Bank, the government expects to launch something that is called a sidecar fund facility that will provide $200 million in equity financing to very, 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 very early stage, scalable, and investment-ready startups, right, that are almost just beyond the idea stage, by matching support from identified angel investors on eligible networks. So there are angel networks of private resourced individuals who provide angel financing to these startups. We are going to encourage them by having a matching sidecar fund, and whatever they finance and risk with their own money, we will match up to $200 million. Well, This is going to be an IDB facility to be approved in the first quarter of this financial year. We expect, Mr. Speaker, that the sidecar fund will address issues that hinder female participation in technology scalable startups. Again, Mr. Speaker, microcredit, MSMEs, SMEs, female entrepreneurs. This, Mr. Speaker, represents economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, there are persons from my constituency here today from Pembroke Hall Primary and Junior Secondary School, and I believe Marvelly as well. I wish to welcome them. We are seized with human capital development, and we'll be allocating $1.25 billion to the Ministry of Education to continue the work in improving the quality of education by upgrading school infrastructure, facilitating the primary exit profile strategy, building capacity, and promoting safety in school. On the theme of economic opportunity for all, Mr. Speaker, the government is focused on increasing the accessibility of tertiary education, as this is a promising means by which economic opportunity can be expanded. And Mr. Speaker, we are joined in the audience by students from UTEC, from Northern Caribbean University, and from the Caribbean Maritime Institute. Can you please welcome them? In 2019-20, the government will provide grant support of approximately $3 billion to the Student Loan Bureau. In the past 3 years, the value of loans disbursed by the SLB has increased by over 22%. In 2017-18, because we don't have a full year for this year, 99% of applicants to the SLB were successful. And this is an increase from 96% in 2016-17 and 95% in 2015-16. A new board has been appointed to the SLB with a mandate to ensure that financing for tertiary education continues to be affordable and accessible, and that the revolving loan fund becomes sustainable. The new board is developing a strategy to achieve these objectives, including improving the SLB's use of technology and its management of loan delinquencies. Nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, in keeping with the objective of expanding economic opportunity for all, the Student Loan Bureau will be implementing the following reforms. For new loans, Mr. Speaker, application of payments will be made to the most outstanding balance first. Historically, Mr. Speaker, for decades, payments made to the SLB by borrowers were applied and have been applied first to the penalties, then to interest, and only after you overcome those, then you get to the payments, the principal. This, Mr. Speaker, is not in keeping with the practice of financial institutions generally and makes servicing of SLB loans harder to service. So when the Prime Minister, and permit me, says he wants certain public bodies who have a financial function to have people with financial institution expertise on them, there was an uproar. We put some, just by having people with banking expertise take a look at what SLB has been doing for decades. This policy revision is being made today. Economic opportunity for all, Mr. Speaker, means that payments by borrowers of the SLB will be applied to most outstanding principal payment and interest payments first. Effective immediately, Mr. Speaker. Rather effective eligible borrowers. 1st of April. effective the 1st of April. Take a water. Eligible borrowers in good standing with the Student Loan Bureau will be entitled to a reduction in their interest rates of 2 percentage points. In keeping with the reduction in the BOJ policy rate over the time since the last adjustment. So, for the postgraduate loans, April 1st, for people in good standing, will be reduced from 9% to 7.5%. And, Mr. Speaker, for the pay-as-you-go loan, which are the super secured loans, they'll be reduced from 6% to 4%, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the third reform, all borrowers employed full-time, all borrowers from the Student Loan Bureau, employed full-time to registered charities in good standing will have 10% of their loan balance forgiven for each full year that they are employed full-time to a registered charity effective April 1st, 2019. Mr. Speaker, I operated a charitable organization for approximately 10 years before politics, and some of you here have a similar experience. I know of the difficulties and challenges, and there are many charities doing excellent work across Jamaica that the government could never, ever replace. We want to encourage charitable organizations. We want to encourage talented graduates to consider the NGO space, even for a few years, as we work together to build a better Jamaica. This policy, Mr. Speaker, helps the students, helps the charitable organization, helps the vulnerable population served by charities, and helps Jamaica. We are improving access to tertiary education. We are expanding economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, with the advance of telecommunications and technology, increasingly services are being delivered remotely. Accounting services, programming services, even medical services. And Jamaica has an excellent opportunity to participate in the higher valued segments of the global services sector. In this budget, therefore, $192 million has been allocated to the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries to fund the new Global Services Project to be coordinated by JAMPRO and in coordination with HART for the purposes of training and upskilling Jamaicans to participate in the higher valued global services sector. This, Mr. Speaker, is developing our human capital and expanding economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, we will be, for the first time, making a direct provision of $200 million to specifically fund research and development to be carried out by faculty and our students at our tertiary institutions. Research is of fundamental importance in achieving our vision for Jamaica. 200 million. Around the world, around the world, government spending on research and development has been responsible for some of the most impactful scientific and technological breakthroughs that we know. The internet itself, the GPS, the original algorithms that power Google, many vaccines and many other advances spring from research, all funded by governments around the world. We have many challenges in Jamaica that could benefit from dedicated research led by the best minds at all our universities. We will make grant funding available on a competitive basis where invitations for proposals will be issued in particular areas in which the government has a need or interest. A transparent and independent mechanism for allocating these research grants will be established. And Mr. Speaker, this will contribute to the development of our human capital and will ultimately expand economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to one of the most important parts of my presentation, namely protecting the poor and vulnerable during the period of transformation of the Jamaican economy. We are strengthening social protection in the 2019-20 budget. So far in my presentation, I have emphasized the importance of strengthening the capacity for economic independence, maintaining stability to sustain long-term growth and economic opportunity for all. Even as we celebrate these achievements, we should not lose sight of the fact that many among us are poor and vulnerable to economic shocks. But with success, economic success, comes opportunities, and the downward trajectory of our public debt and the increased buoyancy of our revenues have opened fiscal space for this government to begin to address long overdue human capital development issues and to step up further interventions to protect the poor and vulnerable. Children are among the most vulnerable groups and account for almost 1/2 of those living in poverty. Other vulnerable groups include persons with disabilities, the homeless, the elderly, and youth, as well as those within the category of the working poor. Since this administration, Mr. Speaker, we have been scaling up budgetary allocation to the main social protection programs. For example, budgetary allocations, just as a factual matter, to PATH and school feeding in 2019-20 are 72% higher than the budgetary allocation for these programs 3 years ago in 2015-16. Mr. Speaker, there are persons in this audience who are on the PATH program, and I ask you to welcome them. The government of Jamaica will be adopting a more strategic approach to social protection and poverty reduction in Jamaica. A strategic medium to long-term focus will include a comprehensive public expenditure review of existing interventions to analyze targeting, graduation rates, efficiency, and adequate funding for key interventions. The public expenditure review will allow for better targeting, better outcomes, reduced non-compliance, and better deployment of caseworkers to ensure conditionalities are met. In the meantime, Mr. Speaker, we are increasing the allocation across our portfolio of major social protection programs from $16 billion in 2018-19 to $20 billion in 2019-20, an increase of approximately 25%. That, Mr. Speaker, is protection of the vulnerable in action. And I'll share with you some of the more greater detail. With respect to PATH conditional cash grants, having regard to the established criteria for the review of PATH benefits, the Ministry of Labour and Social Security has proposed an average increase of 16% to PATH grants with effect from June 2019 to the estimated 284,000 beneficiaries who fall within the vulnerable groups of children and elderly. The proposed increases in cash grants to beneficiaries range from 14% to 23% for the 19-20 financial year. Mr. Speaker, $8.3 billion has been allocated to the PATH program to facilitate PATH cash grants inclusive of those increases. With this increase, Mr. Speaker, over the course of the Andrew Holness administration, individual cash grants under PATH will have increased by between 45 and 55%. This, Mr. Speaker, is evidence of our commitment to protection of the vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, under the PATH school feeding program, an additional allocation of $347 million, representing a 7% increase, has been made available to facilitate the expansion of the program of the school feeding program to PATH beneficiaries at the early childhood level. The total allocation to school feeding for the 1920 financial year will therefore be $5.1 billion, up from $4.8 billion in 2018-19. An additional allocation, Mr. Speaker, of $200 million has been provided to the Ministry of Education under the Examination Fees Assistance Program to support payment for 4 additional subjects for part secondary school students sitting CSEC examination. This increases the allocation for the PATH examination fee by 50%, Mr. Speaker, from $400 million to $600 million. Mr. Speaker, an allocation of $562 million is included in the budget to support retention of the PATH Back to School grant, which was first introduced in August 2018 from normal flows, the benefit of which will be institutionalized under PATH payments and made once a year in August. Mr. Speaker, an allocation of $380 million in budgetary support has been made to the Ministry of Education to support the provision of a transportation grant in schools to those on the PATH program. This initiative, Mr. Speaker, is being pursued as a strategy to significantly reduce the transportation cost of 7,500 students who are registered beneficiaries of PATH attending 94 schools. The increased allocation, Mr. Speaker, for PATH by $180 million is a 90% increase from $200 million in the last financial year to $380 million, Mr. Speaker. 90% increase. These budgetary allocations to expand PATH school feeding, to expand PATH examination assistance, to expand PATH transportation, in addition to the average 16% increase in PATH cash grants, represent, Mr. Speaker, protection of the vulnerable in action. Mr. Speaker, and we're not finished with protection of the vulnerable. A new budgetary allocation of $1 billion has been made to the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation to support implementation of an island-wide social housing program across 63 constituencies. This, Mr. Speaker, represents protection of the vulnerable in action. Mr. Speaker, the government is increasing its allocation to the Jamaica Integrated Community Development Project by 41%, or $627 million, and will spend a total of $2 billion on that project this year, Mr. Speaker. This project contributes to increased community safety and violence prevention in 17 economically vulnerable and socially volatile communities, and enhances access to basic infrastructure and services, such as sanitation, water, and electricity. This, Mr. Speaker, represents protection of the vulnerable in action. Mr. Speaker, the government is increasing its allocation to the Poverty Reduction Program by 174%, or $349 million. This project is the 4th phase of a program supporting poverty reduction in Jamaica through grant funding from the European Union. Mr. Speaker, this represents protection of the vulnerable in action. Mr. Speaker, the government is increasing its allocation to the Basic Needs Trust Fund several-fold, from $163 million this year to $573 million next year. The Basic Needs Trust Fund, that's financed by a grant from the CDB, works on the programs to upgrade rural primary schools and support micro-community enterprises through 14 projects throughout the financial year in select communities. This, Mr. Speaker, represents protection of the vulnerable in action. The vulnerable, Mr. Speaker, include women subject to domestic abuse and violence. Mr. Speaker, the Minister responsible for Gender Affairs is being allocated $126 million to facilitate the establishment of 2 new centers for women who are victims of domestic violence, which will be available by the end of 1920 financial year. We will have 1 center to serve each of 3 counties up from one overall in Cornwall, in Middlesex, and in Surrey. This, Mr. Speaker, represents protection of the vulnerable in action. Mr. Speaker, allocation to the Citizens Security and Justice Program has been increased by $300 million, or 27%, from 1.4 for a total of $1.4 billion in 1920. This program aims at providing social intervention and behavior change in conflict resolution. This, Mr. Speaker, is protection of the vulnerable in action. Mr. Speaker, $25 million is being allocated. This is very important. $25 million is being allocated to complete and finalize the 6 codes of practice and attendant regulations under the National Disabilities Act, which was passed in Parliament in 2014, 4.5 years ago, but has not yet been given an effective date due to the delays in completing the codes of practice. The Act provides a legislative framework for the protection of rights of persons with disabilities. And, Mr. Speaker, the initiatives identified, and this, Mr. Speaker, will be an important step in facilitating inclusion in the population of persons with disabilities in national development. This, Mr. Speaker, is protection of the vulnerable in action. So I repeat, Mr. Speaker, the initiatives identified reflect total increases of approximately $4 billion in budgetary support towards protection of the vulnerable in the upcoming financial year across our portfolio of major social programs across ministries, from $16 billion to $20 billion, an increase of approximately 25%. Mr. Speaker, $600 million has been included in the budget to increase pensions for retired government employees, which is in addition to the $600 million increase that was recently approved by the Cabinet for this current financial year. Yes. Mr. Speaker, earlier this year it was announced that the 120,000 NIS pensioners would benefit from a 14% increase in pensions. And the Ministry is working on expanding the enrollment in the NIS program. Mr. Speaker, all of these initiatives are aimed at making the process of growth more equitable and inclusive, and they complement our other initiatives that are focused on moving Jamaicans from poverty to prosperity. Increasing access to financing for all, public and private opportunities for microcredit, credit union reform, pension reform, small business support, all provide avenues for everyone, including tertiary students, NGOs, to participate in the growth prospects in Jamaica. This, Mr. Speaker, is growth with equity. Mr. Speaker, self-financed public bodies as instruments of government policy contribute to the strategic development of the economy. The planned capital program for self-financed public bodies for financial year 2019-20 is projected at $71.9 billion, an increase of 23% over the $58.5 billion in the current financial year. Combined central government and public body capital expenditure, Mr. Speaker, for 2019-20 is programmed at a record $140 billion. 4 of the entities, namely National Housing Trust, National Water Commission, Petrodram, and the Port Authority, account for 80% of the planned expenditure by these public bodies. The NHT will be spending $39 billion, Mr. Speaker. The National Water Commission, $7.2 billion. The Port Authority, $4.4 billion. Petrodram Limited will be spending $10.4 million for major maintenance works on the storage tanks at the plant. Mr. Speaker, the government's privatization efforts of public bodies will be geared towards broadening the ownership base of the Jamaican economy. This government wants the people of Jamaica to own more of the productive assets of our economy. To this end, Mr. Speaker, we will use the Jamaica Stock Exchange in our privatization efforts. And as has been announced, Wigton Wind Farm is scheduled to be listed on the Jamaica Stock Exchange shortly. We expect the offer to be heavily subscribed. The government of Jamaica, therefore, will reserve 20% of the issue for public sector employees, ensuring that they have a chance to own a piece of the first renewable energy company to list on the Jamaica Stock Exchange. This, Mr. Speaker, represents economic opportunity for all. For all. For all, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, I turn my attention to revenue measures. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica has one of the highest tax rates in our region. When statutory deductions are included, government tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, and I hope that that chart will come up. Government tax revenues as a percentage of GDP is among the highest in our region. Some of this reflects the fact that we have had years and years of unproductive government borrowing that did not result in real improvements in government revenue. As a result, we sought to add tax on top of tax to pay for debt service. Mr. Speaker, since the year 2001, successive governments have levied a total of approximately $130 billion of net new taxes on the Jamaican people. 130 billion. And our growth rate over this period, an annual average of 0.5%. Over the past 10 years, Mr. Speaker, successive governments have levied a total of approximately $90 billion of net new taxes on the Jamaican people. 90 over the last 10 years. And our growth rate over this period, an annual growth rate of 0.2%. I have a chart that shows, yes, it will be in the printed copy. The blue represents the tax increases, the yellow would be the givebacks, and there's a net that will follow. Mr. Speaker, the economy does not grow at optimal levels when we are so heavily taxed. Mr. Speaker, we know taxes punish growth. So for decades, we have patched up the tax system with a slew of tax incentives, which we hope would have spurred growth. So with the high tax regime, we put some incentive to relieve some people, and we hope that would work. Well, that approach failed. The results of the 40 years speak for themselves. 4 decades of flat growth, 0.9%, and per capita income was stagnant. We found ourselves on the brink and engaged in a period of reforms over 2 administrations, which are now bearing fruit: tax reform, incentive reform, and what the IMF described as the bold direct to indirect reform. De-earmarking, pension reform, implementing technology, strengthen audit capacity, and transfer pricing rules. There was a time, Mr. Speaker, when revenues would always underperform. In fact, Mr. Speaker, over the 18-year period, show the graph, from 1997-98 to 2015-16, only once did we collect budgeted tax revenues. We were always in shortfall, and the graph will show it. In the last 3 years, Mr. Speaker, under this administration, not only have budgeted revenues been attained, but they have been surpassed. And I'll remind you that in the first 2 of those 3 years, the bold direct to indirect tax reform was implemented. You said it would work. For 3 consecutive years, for 3 consecutive years, we must accept the other tax reform and incentive reform, and you don't want to accept the fact that direct to indirect helps economic efficiency. For 3 consecutive years, Mr. Speaker, we have seen revenue overperform by an equivalent of 0.8% of GDP per year. in this 2018-19 financial year, we're able to use that overperformance to pay off long-standing government
Do not
arrears.
disrupt the speaker. Do not proceed. Do not disrupt the speaker. You go ahead, Mr. Speaker.
Local government arrears to
Order,
JPS,
both sides.
arrears to SMEs, health fund arrears. And we have increased the payments of tax refunds outstanding to businesses. After almost 20 years of consistent tax increases and no new taxes last year, it is now time to give back. It is a right thing to do. Mr. Speaker, we still have the challenge of high debt and growth below what we want. Therefore, we have to give back in a way that is calibrated to have a stimulative impact on growth. As a result, Mr. Speaker, our first priority in giving back is to phase out taxes that are most distortionary to economic activity and that cut across all sectors of the economy. Mr. Speaker, we will also want to phase out distortionary taxes in a fiscally responsible way, where we remain on track to hit our debt to GDP target of 60% in March 25-26. For our economy to grow faster, we must have more economic activity, more persons starting businesses, more persons engaged in transactions. Government taxes that are levied without reference to profitability or value creation disincentivize small business. They encourage informality and they impede economic growth. Mr. Speaker, the minimum business tax is distortionary. The minimum business tax imposes a tax of $60,000 a year on every company without regard to whether it's struggling or performing, whether it is a startup or it is mature. Whether it is making a loss or it is making a profit. It is an indiscriminate tax that discourages business formation and activity. The business owner just starting their catering business or their small farm or their cleaning business, before they even have $1 of revenue, they become liable to pay the minimum business tax. That is no way to encourage small business. The student leaving UTEC or National or NCU or UE with ideas to start a small business becomes liable for a minimum business tax on the 1st of March after incorporation. That's how it's implemented. That's how it's implemented. That is how it's implemented. We'll talk afterwards. That is no way to encourage entrepreneurship. Your business is in trouble. It was going good, but you lose 2 contracts. The government still wants the minimum business tax. Mr. Speaker, it is so indiscriminate, it applies whether the company is active or is dormant. Mr. Speaker, we want to encourage incorporation, and we want the holding of assets in corporate form to be an attractive option. The principle of hitting dormant companies with a minimum business tax works against a Jamaica that wants to grow. For this reason, Mr. Speaker, effective April 1st, we will abolish the minimum business tax.
Order, please, order.
Mr. Speaker.
Order, please.
Mr. Speaker, a new...
Order, please, do not disturb the speaker.
A new Jamaica is emerging, one that is creating economic opportunity for all. And I don't think everybody in here really understands it. The story, I'll tell you the story of somebody, Tracy. Tracy. Wait. This is a true story, allow me. Tracy started out. John is true too. Have to hide the identity. But Tracy started selling newspapers about 30 years ago on the street. Graduated to selling drinks and sweets. Had these little stalls on the roadside near a complex that had lots of companies. Every day faithfully arriving on their bike, on her bike. Construction mentality, come in, right? And they tear down the buildings and build in their place new construction that employed lots of people. No, this is Tracy. Why not? And Tracy is now selling to a larger pool of people. Tracy, show them the stall if we have it. I hope they can. Tracy has upgraded, right, the stall, and is selling to a wide group of people, couple hundred people. Tracy has bought a van, still get up at 4 a.m. every day. Tracy has bought a house, Mr. Speaker. Johnny have job, Tracy have house, Mr. Speaker. No, it's true. No. And Johnny to meet Tracy. So, Mr. Speaker, on a serious note, we want... No, because you're laughing. You're laughing. No, listen, we want to... Yes, don't want to ignore it. Mr. Speaker,
please address the Speaker.
It is that transition from the street vendor to the micro organization, to the small organization, to the middle organization, to the larger. It is that transition that we want to facilitate. So, Mr. Speaker, if you graduate from Hart Cosmetology School and you intend to start a hairdresser business, or you go to Hart Automotive School and you want to start a garage, or you want to start a barber shop, or a digital animation company, and you get the help from your aunt, and you take a loan, and you have $600,000, which is a loan, and you use it to buy $600,000 of assets. You have to pay asset tax of $100,000 to the government before you make a single cent in profit. That is not how we encourage entrepreneurship and innovation. The asset tax for non-financial businesses can be harsh on small business, and it imposes wildly different effective tax rates depending on the circumstances of that small business. Just think about Tracy as I talk. This asset tax, Mr. Speaker, for non-financial business is distortionary. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, we will abolish the asset tax for non-financial business. Speaker, as I said, for economy to grow faster, we must have more economic activity, more persons starting businesses, more persons employing business, more persons engaged in transactions. That is economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, the general consumption tax is a very important tax for government, making up a significant percentage of total tax revenue.
Order, please, order.
It's a serious tax as non-compliance attracts punitive penalties. For this reason, it is a tax that businesses have to pay keen attention to, as should be the case. Compliance with the GCT, Mr. Speaker, is to keep appropriate records and to compile correct returns takes substantial resources. And many micro businesses, small, find the custom compliance difficult. A micro business should not have to choose between paying for a new salesperson or a factory worker, or moving out of the garage into the factory and devoting resources to complying with the GCT. For this reason, Mr. Speaker, there's a threshold below which GCT does not apply. This threshold has been $3 million since 2009.
Some order, please. Do not disturb the Speaker.
It's not implemented. We want to reduce the cost of business for small and medium-sized enterprises. We want to support small business. We want to encourage young people to get into business. For this reason, Mr. Speaker, we will be moving the threshold for filing GCT from $3 million to $10 million effective April 1st. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've had productive discussions on this topic with the member from Central Manchester. So we can see that even he has his moments. Yes.
Minister, don't encourage them. Minister, address the Speaker. Do not.
This, Mr. Speaker, will mean that approximately 3,500 small businesses that currently file GCT will no longer be required to do so. Tax administration. Tax administration Jamaica, which currently has to see to the compliance of these 3,500 firms, will now free up resources, allowing them to concentrate on larger businesses and ensure their compliance. This, Mr. Speaker, is economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, the government of Jamaica currently imposes stamp duty and transfer tax on a wide variety of transactions. Some stamp duties are charged at a flat rate, $500 or $5,000, and others are ad valorem, which means it varies according to the value of the transaction. In addition, there are a multitude of stamp duty rates for different kinds of transactions, enough to confuse you. Stamp duties and or transfer tax are applicable to almost all asset transfers and the documentation that accompanies these transfers. Transfers of land, transfers of mortgages, transfers of loans, transfers of securities, all attract these taxes. In addition, Mr. Speaker, giving of security for loan attracts ad valorem stamp duty, whether the security offered is inventory, whether it's land, whether it's equipment, whether it's receivables, whether it's shares or other types of assets. Mr. Speaker, the trading of shares on a stock exchange, whether it's a junior or the senior market, is exempt from ad valorem stamp duty and transfer taxes, the reason being that these taxes impede the proper and efficient function of equity markets, Similarly, Mr. Speaker, if we want the market for loans and mortgages and securities and receivables, which is the largest asset of small business, you have to pay, let me not even go into it, and land to function effectively, and for transaction volumes to increase, and for economic and business activity to thrive, which in turn provides a foundation for economic growth, government should not be taxing these transactions. Mr. Speaker, interest rates have been lowered 7 successive times, 4 times in this current year alone, and are at record lows today. Some banks lower faster than others. It's through competition of financial institutions and loan rates that the customer ends up with the best deal. However, the competition in the loan market is hampered due to the fact that customers incur high transaction costs to switch lenders due to government taxes that have to be paid to give security to the new lender. In order to enjoy the increased productivity gains from lower interest rates, increased economic and business activity from higher transaction volume, and higher rates of growth, we must reduce the burden of government transaction taxes. Mr. Speaker, the business that has a debenture over its assets and gets a bank offer should not have a better bank offer, shouldn't have to pay the government high stamp transaction taxes to accept that offer. The public sector employee who has a mortgage with a bank, who wants to take advantage of a better offer, should not have to pay the government ad valorem, high ad valorem transaction taxes to accept a better offer from another lender. The small business that goes to Microcredit firm and grants a bill of sale over its equipment to facilitate a loan should not have to pay the government high transaction taxes in order to accept a better offer from another microcredit firm. The construction company that needs to register, you talk about local construction, the construction company that needs to register a performance bond in order to compete for a contract should not have to pay the government high transaction taxes for this privilege. The small business that wants to assign some of its receivables to obtain financing should not have to pay a hefty sum to the government for the privilege. Receivables, as I've said twice, are the largest pool of assets held by businesses. And we want an environment where businesses can raise capital by pledging receivables and having those perfected. But this becomes, it's not practically feasible for small business when the government stands in the way with high transaction taxes. The manufacturer that wants to increase its share capital to ensure it has sufficient capital should not have to pay the government high transaction taxes to do so. The Jamaican who has been on a land owned by her parents and grandparents and now wants to have that land registered so she can have a title, so she can have a place on the rock, so she can have a place within Jamaica that is her own, that is recognized by the state, should not have to pay the government ad valorem transaction taxes. We want her to register the land. We want there to be a title and for her to have her name on the title. Greater formalization, Mr. Speaker, is in the public interest. So why discourage it all with high transaction taxes? Mr. Speaker, these ad valorem stamp duties are distortionary. These high ad valorem stamp duties disincentivize the very activities we want to encourage. These ad valorem stamp duties discourage transactions. They discourage competition. These stamp duties impede access to finance for all, but particularly micro and small businesses. They discourage business activity. They discourage capital formation. They discourage formalization. These high ad valorem stamp duties are anti-growth. The worst part, Mr. Speaker, is that at the time in a life cycle of a company, small, medium or large, that it may be stumbling and in need of restructuring. Even this restructuring, and you are familiar with it, we all are familiar with examples, even this restructuring is impeded by high transaction costs. High transaction costs lead to an inefficient and distorted allocation of resources. For this reason, Mr. Speaker, we will abolish distortionary ad valorem stamp duties applicable to the processes of registering land, issuing a bond, assignments, registering a debenture, registering a mortgage, whether it's primary or other, refinancing a mortgage, discharging a mortgage, and other stamp duties involved in the granting and perfecting of other forms of securities, in addition to stamp duties applied in the increasing of share capital. In its place, Mr. Speaker, we will have nominal processing fees that do not disincentivize these transactions. These fees will be $5,000 per transaction, which when multiplied by existing volume, hopefully approximates. So when you hear that interest rates are moving down and yours not moving, and some other institution offers you a better rate, phase the financial institution out. The government will not stand in your way. Mr. Speaker, This government has firmly resolved to increase home ownership in Jamaica. We have made important progress with the most housing starts of any administration in the last 2 decades. NHT housing starts in the first 2 years of this administration were greater than the previous administration completed in 4 years. That's a fact. In addition, in the upcoming financial year, NHT plans 8,640 housing starts, which in 1 year is more than the complete 4 years of the previous administration. And Mr. Speaker, we want to do more. How many times have you heard, Mr. Speaker, of instances where the mortgage loan is available, even the deposit might be available, but the closing costs were not anticipated and the young couple has difficulty closing and has to defer their dream? How many members of Parliament recognize this with their constituents? Mr. Speaker, the closing costs on homes often make it difficult for low-income earners. On a simple, in the open market, on a simple $5 million home, assuming 100% financing, the closing cost of the buyer can be $156,000. Now, the person buying a $5 million home, is at the lower end of the income spectrum. When you add up stamp duty of 4% and they have to pay half, registration fee, stamp duty and mortgage, $156,000. Mr. Speaker, the high stamp duty and transfer tax on property affects the mobility of labor, as labor becomes less willing to move in search of opportunity due to the high cost of switching in and out of a home. Mr. Speaker, high stamp duty and transfer tax on property discourages downsizing. For the retired couple on fixed income with grown children, it does not make sense to sell their house, incur large transaction taxes, and purchase a smaller unit and incur more transaction taxes. With an aging population that has suffered from stagnant growth for 40 years and limited land availability, this does not make sense. The society benefits from a recirculation of the housing stock to those who can maximize use of space. Our tax system should encourage rather than discourage being able to choose the right home for one's circumstances. High stamp duty and transfer tax on property also increases the risk to property developers. The higher the transaction cost, the more errors of judgment are compounded, and unforeseen adverse changes in business parameters lead to severe consequences. With high transaction costs, individuals and institutions are more hesitant. They wait. After 40 years, Mr. Speaker, of low growth, we can't afford any more hesitancy. We can't afford waiting. We can't afford government-induced high-risk premium on property. High transaction costs for property also has a distortive impact on capital allocation in the economy, whereas equities on the stock exchange do not attract these transaction taxes, property purchases do. If we continue to do this, we create a bias towards one asset class, public equities, over real estate, even for primary homes, which can have unintended consequences. For this reason, Mr. Speaker, we will abolish ad valorem stamp duty on properties on April 1st and replace it with a fee of $5,000 that approximates the value of providing the service. This, Mr. Speaker, represents economic opportunity for all on transfers of property. Yes, stamp duty, ad valorem, we're abolishing, flat fee. Mr. Speaker, we strengthened property taxes in 2017, and the time has now come to reduce property transfer taxes. Like stamp duty, these taxes increase the cost of buying and selling properties, and all the reasons I mentioned earlier apply here. As such, Mr. Speaker, we will reduce transfer tax on property from 5% to 2% effective April 1st. Mr. Speaker, there's a lot of property tied up in the estates of those who have passed away. where Jamaican families want to sell the property and use the proceeds in a straightforward way for varied economic purposes and are unable to do so because of the estate transfer tax. Successive governments have recognized this concern, and we have had reductions over time under prior administrations, and so on. But we want to go further. The exemption was first set at $10,000 in 1974. It was raised to $100,000 in 2005 and has been at that level since. Mr. Speaker, we will raise the exemption threshold on estate transfer tax from $100,000 to $10 million effective April 1st. This will allow for greater mobility of assets, which is consistent with our drive for economic growth. This will allow for greater mobility. We don't collect anything. This will allow for greater mobility of assets, which is consistent with our drive for economic growth.
Minister, don't get distracted.
This, Mr. Speaker, is economic opportunity for all. Mr. Speaker, too many Jamaicans in 2019 are still unable to afford home ownership, to own a place of their own, to build on it, to borrow against it, and to pass it on to their children and grandchildren. The sum of these policies announced today are designed to address this problem, which dates back to our foundation as a country. Mr. Speaker, the abolishment and lowering of these distortionary taxes means that the government will forego approximately $14 billion. This is the first time in decades, in living memory, and I'm just using that to be conservative, that any government of Jamaica is giving back taxes on a net basis to the Jamaican people. And it is well overdue. After more than $130 billion of taxes, net taxes in the last 20 years, and approximately $90 billion of net taxes in the last 10 years, and with decades of sluggish growth, the time is right for a tax reduction. Mr. Speaker, this is a $14 billion tax stimulus that abolishes and lowers distortionary transaction taxes to catalyze increased transaction volume, increase business and economic activity, and increase economic growth. These measures will stimulate micro-business, they will stimulate small business, they'll stimulate the credit market, they'll stimulate the construction sector, they'll stimulate real estate market, they'll stimulate formality, they'll stimulate overall economic activity, Mr. Speaker. It will lead to a more liquid real estate market, support more agents, more valuators, more property transactions, more property turnover, more plumbers, more carpenters, more masons who prepare properties for purchase and sale. This will have second-order effects, Mr. Speaker, for manufacturers who make household furnishing, household goods and building materials, more cement, more sand, more stone, more windows, more doors, more furniture, more economic opportunity. And importantly, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, very importantly, more jobs for Johnny. And him can choose. Mr. Speaker, this represents economic opportunity for all in action. Mr. Speaker, now I just turn my attention to the other side. These tax cuts, Mr. Speaker, are being implemented in the context of, one, continued buoyancy in tax revenues, the extent of which wouldn't have been fully assured at the time of printing of the fiscal policy paper, and by a lowering of the primary surplus target from 7% of GDP to 6.5% of GDP. This has been arrived at in a staff-level agreement with the IMF, who are in Kingston for the 5th review under the precautionary standby arrangement. So, just repeating that, Mr. Speaker, this has been arrived at, the lowering of the primary surplus target from 7% of GDP to 6.5% of GDP has been arrived at in a staff-level agreement with the IMF, who are in Kingston for the 5th review under the precautionary standby arrangement. With respect to the continued tax revenue buoyancy, this House will be reminded that at the time of the computation of the revenue estimates, the second supplementary estimates would have been the best approximation for the full 2018-19 outcome on which the 2019-20 revenue estimates were computed. Since that time, we've had the benefit of the confirmed revenue for January and February, bearing in mind that this is March 7th, which cumulatively show a healthy overperformance relative to the second supplementary revenue estimates of 2019-20 and which may require a third supplementary. More specifically, Mr. Speaker, tax revenue performance up to February 2018 against the second supplementary budget has been substantially above program, resulting in a revised forecast for the fiscal year 2018-19 that indicates an expected full-year performance of total revenue at $3.7 billion more than the second supplementary estimates. This estimated increase in 2018-19 revenue translates to an expected increase in 2019-20 and across the medium term. So, Mr. Speaker, the 0.5% reduction in the primary balance target, which approximates $10.9 billion, along with the translation of the overperformance into the further overperformance into financial year 2019-20 and across the medium term, allows us to more than adequately fund the tax reduction. As such, Mr. Speaker, a revised revenue estimate, and I ask for the cooperation on this, for financial year 2019-20 is being tabled that takes account of both the tax buoyancy and the revenue measures. Really just very few line items change. And we are also providing a revised table outlining the medium-term profile using the 6.5% primary balance target. It is within this context that I now table Ministry Paper number 13/19 entitled Revenue Measures 2019-20, as well as the revised revenue estimates for 2019-20 for the financial year ending 31st March 2020, and ask for your cooperation. Now, Mr. Speaker, we have had the goal of reducing transaction taxes, and it's been signaled in our Memorandum of Economic and Financial Policies under our precautionary standby agreement with the fund. Recently, we presented to the IMF that given Jamaica's improved debt dynamics, with the projected achievement of the 96% debt to GDP target in March 2019, 1 year ahead of the original, if you will recall, March 2020 projection, we had room to bring forward the 0.5% of GDP reduction in the primary balance target to this financial year and still meet our 2026 debt target. This primary balance reduction would ensure that we could reduce transaction taxes and at the same time increase growth-enhancing spending in citizen security, social support and path, as well as rural infrastructure, as I highlighted earlier in my presentation. As the opposition would be fully aware, the lower primary surplus target could not have been announced until a staff-level agreement was reached with the IMF. Mr. Speaker, not once in the last quarter century or more has a government of Jamaica returned taxes to the people on a net basis. The government of the sacrifices of the people of Jamaica from all segments of society in putting Jamaica on the path of fiscal sustainability has to be acknowledged and appreciated. After years and years of tax increases, the time has come to return taxpayers' money to the people. Importantly, however, this decision is being done in a thoughtful, responsible manner and in a way that best stimulates economic activity and promotes inclusive growth. The reduction in distortive transaction taxes will enable economic opportunity and job creation, while the increases in social spending, the increased allocation towards micro, small and medium-sized lending, the improved access to finance for students, for micro and small businesses and others, along with the procurement reform the microcredit reform, the credit union reform, the pension reform, promises to make the growth process inclusive. The budget presented today, Mr. Speaker, focused on 3 clear objectives: achieving and sustaining economic independence, expanding economic opportunity for all, and protecting the vulnerable in our society. We can all agree that there have been times in our history when we have lost our focus on one or more of these critical objectives. Today, we have the historical opportunity to pursue them all. In pursuing them all, Mr. Speaker, we are moving in the right direction, and that direction is clear: the pursuit of economic growth balanced with social equity. Thank you, God bless you, and may God bless Jamaica.
Members, we are still in session. Members in the gallery, please be seated or move quietly out. The House is still in session. Order, please. Mrs. Cook. Order, please. Minister Clarke, I notice you're having some water. You can do that. I'd advise you that I have been here for 3 decades, and I have never seen both sides hailing any minister. You must have said something good. I have never seen the minister being hailed by the leader of the opposition, and he has done it several times. You may now speak to me, Mr. Speaker. Yes. Mr. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I seek the leave of members of this Honourable House for me to withdraw the Jamaica Revenue Estimate 2019-20 for the financial year ending the 31st of March 2020, which was tabled in this House on the 14th day of February 2019, as I wish to substitute it with a revised version.
Members, is this the wish of the House? Those in favour? Those against? As of it. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I now ask that the Jamaica Revenue Estimate 2019-20 for the financial year ending March 31st, 2020 be withdrawn.
Mr. Speaker.
Those in favour?
Aye. Mr. Speaker,
Those in, Minister, I need to take a vote on, I need to take a vote on this. Those in favour? Those against? As of it.
Recommittal of the item announcements.
Those in favour? Those against? As of it. Go ahead, man.
Also laid on the table of the House today is Minister Paper number 13, entitled Revenue Measures for the Financial Year 2019-2020, and the annual report of the Jamaica National Agency for Accreditation, JANAC.
Mr. Semuda.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you will join me and also my colleagues on the other side in saying that this was one of the most stimulating presentations ever given in this Honourable House. And the important thing is that it carried the theme, what is good for Jamaica? Jamaica first. With that, Mr. Speaker, it is not intended to do any further business today, so I invite you to suspend the sitting of the House, adjourn the sitting of the House until next week, Tuesday, March 12th, at 2 p.m. sharp. At 2 p.m. sharp. Now we're quite sure of the date. 2 p.m. sharp.
Order, please. The motion is that the House may now adjourn until next week, Tuesday, at 2 p.m. Those in favor? Those against? This House stands adjourned.
My mother tells me that when I was a teenager, she noticed a dip in my mood every year around the time of exams in school. In my second year of university, I experienced a number of challenging events that led to my very first panic attack. And in my fourth year, I went through the darkest period of my life where I isolated myself from my family and my friends, and I struggled to complete my degree. And I was diagnosed as clinically depressed with anxiety and given prescription medication.
While you need a doctor or a psychiatrist